Thank you for inviting me to present this, and it's lovely to be back here after a long break. The notes that I've prepared, which I'm going to read, more or less, in their entirety, but maybe not completely, are based on the notes I use in my conversion class, where people are preparing to convert to Judaism. I've made various changes, omissions, additions, but that might explain some of the features of the notes that won't read exactly like a regular academic paper, and also some of the, I hope, fairly light touches of liberal Judaism, which are not intended in any way polemically, but that's because the notes are for people who are converting through the liberal branch of Judaism. So we traditionally distinguish between halakha and agadah. Halakha are laws that can be laid down with great authority and in great detail, and those who traditional Jews are obligated to keep them. But in Judaism, the realm of belief comes not in the field of law, but of agadah. So although there might be some disagreement about that with some people, nevertheless, by and large, there's no centralized authority in Judaism that lays down details of beliefs in areas such as the end of days and the afterlife. That isn't to say there aren't such beliefs. There are many, but there are also many varieties of such beliefs in Judaism held by different groups of people. And we'll look at a little bit of that. The most common rabbinic and perhaps important rabbinic term for the future life, is olam haba, the world to come, or le'atid lavo, in the future to come. And these terms are inherently ambiguous. Sometimes they seem to refer to the future of the world as a whole, what will happen to all of us at the end of days. But very often, and perhaps increasingly in later phases of Judaism, they tend to refer to the afterlife of the individual, so something spiritual rather than historical. But these meanings are always closely entangled. Here, I'm not proposing to deal in any detail with personal eschatology, our individual salvation, life after death, reward and punishment, and paradise, and so forth. That might be another paper for another time from somebody. But I'm going to concentrate here, I think that was our intention today, if I remember rightly, on universal eschatology, the beliefs concerning the end of days, and especially the Messiah. I've noted there are a number of biblical terms that relate broadly to redemption or salvation, particularly in a collective sense, but also in an individual sense. I won't read through them all. But what's very obvious when you look at these terms, ge'ulah, redemption, pidyon, ransom, nasal, deliverance from danger, etc., is that these terms, which have acquired such vast theological baggage, all originate in very concrete social and historical experiences. Hi. So the experience of losing one's family land and hoping that there'll be a relative who can buy it back. That's the original meaning of redemption, buying back the land, restoring it to the family, buying a slave's freedom and setting them free, so a sense of liberation, being saved from danger, immediate physical danger, and the one, Yeshua, which is often translated salvation, probably related originally to victory in war, the sense of being victorious. And other terms are rooted very specifically in the historical experience or collective story of the people of Israel, particularly the paradigm of the Exodus from Egypt, and the word which is repeated over and over and over again in the Hebrew Bible, I will bring you out, or I brought you out. It's there in the Ten Commandments. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. And that bringing out from slavery, from a place of narrowness, is the paradigm, perhaps, of redemption. And then the other one, which becomes increasingly important, particularly in the book of Deuteronomy and in later prophetic literature, is the root shuv, a heshiv, to bring back, to return, which presumably grew out of the experience of displacement, of exile, of the Assyrian conquest in the 8th century, the Babylonian conquest in the 6th century, and the idea, the hope, the yearning to be restored, brought back to the land, brought back indeed to God. So these are the prototypes and terms of redemption. Many have argued that whereas ancient Greece, at least some of its literary products, saw the Golden Age as being in the past, Golden Age followed by silver, bronze, iron, and so forth, in a process of decline. Although the Bible starts us off, as it were, in paradise, that doesn't seem to last very long. And the hope is perhaps for the restoration of a paradisal state, but one that will not be so brief, a redemption that will be far more substantial than the original paradisal state. There are other views of history, again, Hellenistic and maybe some Jewish ones, as an ever-repeating cycle where nothing really happens. Everything that happens has already happened before and will happen many times again. In the Bible, this is represented mainly in the book of Kohelet, Ecclesiastes. Prophetic Judaism, in contrast, saw history as a process guided by the Spirit of God and is destined to culminate in an age of national and universal redemption. This redemption, however, would be preceded by national defeat and exile of the Jewish people as part of God's plan to punish and refine them in preparation for their ultimate glory. In many prophetic passages, the age of redemption is spoken of in universalist terms as something that will embrace all of humanity, whereas in other passages it's conceived of in a more particularist way, as the triumph of Israel over its enemies. By Israel, of course, I mean the people Israel, not the modern political state of Israel. Liberal Judaism has always been more comfortable with the universalist dimension of redemption, and so has much of modern Orthodox Judaism, I venture to say, certainly the way I was brought up in a modern Orthodox community, and has downplayed the particularistic or nationalistic aspect. One of the best known of the universalist passages of redemption is printed there from Isaiah chapter 2, and it has a close parallel also in the book of Micah, and it envisages the temple in Jerusalem as not just a cult center for the Jewish people, but a universal center of prayer and a universal center of justice as well. That justice will flow out with the Torah, God's instruction from Jerusalem, and as a result, there'll be no need for conflict, and all will beat their swords into plowshares, their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. This is a justly famous and idealistic passage that envisages a truly universal redemption and a future of human unity. Of course, there are big questions as to how realistically we can treat passages like this, and that's a big question we confront nowadays. And the vast majority of biblical verses that speak of redemption whether personal deliverance or universal salvation, the Redeemer is none other than God, not any other Saviour. So here in Isaiah chapter 2, there's no mention of a messianic ruler. It's God who will arbitrate between the many peoples in some way. Later on in Isaiah, we do have visions of a shoot from the stock of Jesse, as we'll be exploring later, who will reign in justice over all peoples. But mostly it's just God. In the liturgy as well, terms like Goel, Redeemer, and Moshiach, Saviour, generally refer to God. And I've mentioned a few liturgical details there that I'm going to pass over quickly, but you're welcome to look at them. Many prayers in the daily liturgy, recited 3 times a day by those who are sufficiently devout, deal with various aspects of redemption, such as the resurrection of the dead, the ingathering of exiles, the restoration of just rule, the rebuilding of Jerusalem, and the flowering of the shoot of David, the horn of salvation. And at the end of every service, we have a prayer which looks forward to the mending of the world under the rule of God and the universal acceptance of divine unity, which we'll come to at the very end. But turning now to the Messiah specifically. In biblical times, both, and forgive me, I'm sure much of this is known to you here, in biblical times, both kings and priests were inducted into office by anointing with holy aromatic oil, and anyone inducted in this way was known as a Mashiach, or anointed one. At times, the prophets expressed the hope, and here I mean the biblical prophets, from whom we have books in their names, expressed the hope for national redemption, peace and prosperity, using the symbol of a righteous king who would reign with firmness and justice. After the end of the Israelite monarchy, and in times of exile, the hope of redemption became crystallized in the figure of a king restored to the throne of independent Israel, returned to its land. And the name given to this king was the Mashiach, rendered into English as Messiah. From a historical critical point of view, most of the prophetic passages, traditionally thought to refer to a future messianic king, can be applied and understood as applying to a contemporary ancient monarch or prince, such as the important kings Hezekiah, Josiah, or the Judean prince Zerubbabel, who led the exiles back from Persia, from Babylon, in the late 6th century BCE. Or BCE. Even the Persian conqueror Cyrus is spoken of by Deutero-Isaiah as God's anointed Messiah. So the term Mashiach was not necessarily restricted only to Israelites. One rabbi in the Talmud even denies that there will be any Messiah in the future, since he says all the messianic prophecies were fulfilled in the days of King Hezekiah, one of the great reforming kings of Judah in the 8th century. Because of the stories of David, King David, as the most powerful and divinely inspired of the ancient kings, the Psalms, of course, and the divine promises given to him that his line would endure forever, the Messiah was supposed to be a descendant of King David and to come from the tribe of Judah, one of the 12 tribes. The key functions of this Messiah would be to defeat Israel's enemies, gather in the exiles to the land of Israel. And exiles includes not just the Judeans who were exiled to Babylon, but also the lost tribes that were exiled in the 8th century deported by the Assyrians and lost to history, but they would miraculously reappear and be reunited in the future. That's a vision, incidentally, that is also, I find, very prevalent in parts of the New Testament, particularly in the genealogy of Matthew, but that's another matter. Where are we? So he'd rebuild the temple, re-establish the ancient priesthood and temple cult. He would then reign over Israel and the whole world during a period of universal peace and justice. According to most versions, although there are many different versions of these ideas, the messianic reign would not last forever. There are traditions that speak of a millennium, of 1,000 years, but would eventually come to an end and be succeeded either by other kings or by a transformed earth, which in that version of things would be known as the world to come, which would include the resurrection of the dead. All mainstream Jewish authorities were united in seeing the Messiah as a human figure, a great and wise king who would reign in Jerusalem under God's authority. There is sectarian literature, or, well, some might argue with the label sectarian, but literature of the Hellenistic period, which began to speculate about the angelic or semi-divine status of the Messiah. Now, I know that I have to say before I read the next bit that this is vastly overgeneralized, I know, and I'm very happy to be corrected by Christian members of the group. But as Christianity developed, it, to a large extent, I believe, transformed the concept of Messiah to mean primarily, for the Christian faithful, the one who saves the individual from sin and death, rather than the one who saves the nation and the world from injustice, conflict, and misery. Of course, there is the hope of the parousia, the second coming, when all of that will happen too, in Christian belief. And I know that also for many Christians nowadays, the concepts of realized eschatology and the kingdom being here with us in some sense are tremendously important, but I'm generalizing here. For Jews in the rabbinic tradition, Jesus could not be seen as the promised Messiah since he had not relieved Israel of its foreign oppressors, the Romans at the time, gathered in the lost tribes, or ushered in an age of universal peace. In rabbinic Judaism, the role of personal saviour was always reserved to God. The Messiah has nothing to do with my individual soul and its sinfulness and my personal spiritual fate in God's eyes. The Messiah was concerned only with collective redemption at the end of days. Despite the destruction of the temple and the loss of atoning sacrifices, all individuals with God's help could work out their own salvation through keeping the commandments, studying the Torah, repenting for their sins, and performing deeds of loving kindness. And all of these are spoken of in rabbinic theology as means of sort of individual redemption, as it were. But that's not my main topic here. Coming back to the Messiah, the rationalist philosopher Moses Maimonides insists that the Messianic age would not be attended by miracles of a sort of vastly supernatural kind, but be a quite natural human reign distinguished only by the fact that Israel would be free of foreign domination and able to pursue Torah study and philosophical contemplation, which for Maimonides is what you should be doing with your life if you're able to, in a calm and stress-free frame of mind. So in times of exile, when life is violent and uncertain, it's impossible to devote ourselves with clear, single-minded focus to contemplation of God. But the Messianic age will allow us that philosophical luxury. The Talmudist and mystic Moses Nachmanides, a couple of generations after Maimonides, among many others, disagreed sharply with Maimonides' view and took much more literally the Talmudic legends that in the Messianic age the world would be utterly transformed, everything would be perfect, food would grow by itself, no more work would be necessary, and there would be no more sickness, old age, or death. So we have here quite dramatically contrasting, but both perfectly orthodox, as it were, views of the Messianic age. Many legends and mystical beliefs clustered around the concept of the Messiah, such as the idea that he was born on the 9th of Av, the day the temple was destroyed in Jerusalem, and then hidden away in paradise by God until the time of his coming. In a famous Talmudic story, a very elaborate and beautiful story that I'm not going to tell at length, the 3rd century sage Joshua ben Levi met the Messiah, presumably in a vision, because he lived in Lod, near where the airport is now, near Tel Aviv. He met the Messiah among the lepers at the gates of Rome, binding and unbinding his leprous sores and waiting for his call to come.
So the Messiah was a leper?
That's what that story implies, yes, indeed. Another legend is, and these are legends that have been quite important in various Jewish groups at various times. They're not just random legends. Is that a potential Messiah is born in every generation, but only if the generation of Jews is worthy would he be revealed as such. So there's always a kind of Messiah in waiting here in the world, as it were. This idea underpinned the conviction of many Chabad Lubavitch Hasidim that their Rebbe was the Messiah in waiting. I'll say a bit more about that later. Several subsidiary messianic figures are mentioned in ancient and medieval Jewish sources. The most prominent of these is the Mashiach ben Yosef, the Messiah, son of Joseph, who's only mentioned once in the Babylonian Talmud, but then many times in later Midrashic and mystical literature. Now, of course, the Davidic Messiahs from the tribe of Judah and the other great division of ancient Israel was, broadly speaking, Joseph or Ephraim, the northern kingdom, those who were lost in the time of the Assyrian conquest in the 8th century. So this presumably is a Messiah from those tribes, from the tribe of Ephraim. He would lead Israel in the apocalyptic wars, but would then be killed. And the messianic process would then go on to be fulfilled in the Mashiach ben David, the Messiah, son of David. Throughout Jewish history, there's been speculation about the time of the Messiah's coming, although many authorities, both in the Talmud and later, discouraged such speculation. One view, and this is in the Talmud, holds that all the foretold times of redemption have passed. So there's no point, in other words, doing any more calculations, because all the calculations that could have been done have already gone by, and all now depends on human behavior. That was the view of a great 3rd century Babylonian sage. Some thought the Messiah would come only in a righteous generation, but a contrasting opinion was that only when people have sunk to the lowest depths of wickedness, and by people I think it means Jews here, without any respect or decency, would the Messiah appear. So we have, even in the Talmud itself, a marvelous array of contrasting views. Rabbis tried to exhort their communities to better religious conduct by preaching that only when all Jews keep 2 successive Sabbaths perfectly, and if you know about the Orthodox rules for the Sabbath, you'll know that it's quite hard to keep even 1 Sabbath perfectly, and the idea that all Jews would keep 2 successive Sabbaths perfectly, slightly remote possibility, or attain to some other improbable standard of pious behavior, would the Messiah appear. I read those statements as an encouragement to the congregation to step up the religious practice. A mystical teaching, we're leaping forward many centuries now to the 18th century, a mystical teaching attributed to the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of the Hasidic movement in the 18th century, has it that every soul, or he probably meant every Jewish soul, contains in its depths a spark of the Messiah. This language of sparks is very typical of Kabbalistic and Hasidic Judaism. Yeah, a spark of the Messiah. So by elevating and freeing that messianic spark within ourselves, by leading a life of piety and devotion, we help to bring about the ultimate revelation of the Messiah. So we all have our bit to contribute to the Messiah. It's a lovely idea. Based on the verse at the end of the book of Malachi, the last of the biblical prophets, it says, "Lo, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and awesome day of the Eternal One." It came to be believed that the undying prophet Elijah would appear to blow the shofar, the last trumpet, and announce the coming of the Messiah. Elijah would at that point, according to legend, also answer all the difficult Talmudic questions that the learned rabbis were unable to solve. And this belief in the coming of Elijah to herald the Messiah is put into practice in Jewish liturgy, particularly at the end of Shabbat, the end of the Sabbath, Saturday night every week, when you do the ritual concluding the Sabbath, a very poetic ritual, spices and a candle and so forth, and then people sing a song, a folk song, about praying for the coming of Elijah, because Elijah won't come before the Sabbath, because that would disrupt your preparations and your observance of the Sabbath, and Elijah wouldn't be so inconsiderate. But as soon as the Sabbath is over, we hope this will be the week that Elijah will appear. And even people who really don't believe it literally at all still sing the song. It was generally agreed that the Messiah would come after a period of terrible warfare, the mysterious wars of Gog and Magog mentioned in Ezekiel. This period of strife came to be known by various terms, such as Chevlei Mashiach, the birth pangs of the Messiah, or Ikvata de Mashiach, the footsteps, footfalls, if you like, of the Messiah that you hear coming. And this was seen to be a terrible time of suffering. As a result, whenever there was a period of warfare or persecution, messianic fervour and speculation would peak. Frequently at such times a person would appear claiming to be the Messiah, gain a following, and make some kind of attempt to lead people to the land of Israel or otherwise bring about the end. The invariable result was disaster and disillusionment. One of my favourites, I haven't mentioned here, is Abraham Abulaffia, a great mystic of the 13th century, who took it upon himself to go and see the Pope and tell him that he should really convert to Judaism because the Messiah is about to appear, and there's a probability that he thought he might be the Messiah. The Pope ordered that he should be burnt at the stake for his pains, but the day before he was due to actually see the Pope died, which he took as a sign that he was on the right track. Anyway, that's just one of many, many stories, some of them rather comical. The most notorious of the false messiahs was Shabtai Tzvi in Turkey, born in Izmir, who eventually converted to Islam under threat of death. And that's a big story about which there's a huge literature. Who was succeeded by the somewhat lesser figure of Jacob Frank in Poland in the 18th century, who presented himself as a reincarnation of Shabtai Tzvi and who converted to Catholicism. So these depressing examples may have contributed to the distrust of Messianism in more rationalistic circles in the Enlightenment period. But for a couple of years in the 1660s, much of the Jewish world was carried away with messianic fervour and really believed the Messiah. And this news swept through Europe, and Christians across Europe were saying, "Have you heard? The Jewish Messiah has come." And Jews were selling up their properties and preparing to move to Palestine and so forth. It was a massive upheaval in that time. In the late 20th century, an outpouring of messianic expectation within the influential Chabad Lubavitch Hasidic movement. This is a movement that specializes in outreach within the Jewish world, so they're kind of It was an evangelistic kind of movement, mainly amongst Jews, centered on their Rebbe, Menachem Mendel Schneerson, whom his followers saw as a potential Messiah waiting to be revealed. And this was because of events of the Russian Revolution, the First World War, the Holocaust, the Cold War, all of that these were seen as apocalyptic signs that the Messiah is about to appear. And the more the Rebbe said the Messiah is about to appear, the more his followers became convinced that it was him. Since his death in 1994, a minority of his followers, at least one hopes it's a minority, continue to regard him as the Messiah who will return. Which makes you wonder about, the similarities to the origins of Christianity, but that's, as many people have pointed out. So, early Reform Judaism affirmed by early Reform Judaism, I'm talking about the 19th century. Reform Judaism first appears right at the beginning of the 19th century and then gathers force through mid-19th century and onwards, and became dominant in certain parts of the continent, particularly in Germany and Central Europe, and later on in America. So Reform Judaism affirmed the spiritual, ethical, and universal character of Judaism and downplayed the nationalistic and supernatural elements. In embracing Jewish political emancipation and the equality of all people, it rejected the idea of Jews as a separate nation in exile, waiting to be gathered back into its ancestral homeland. Traditional Messianism, therefore, gave way to a more universal and naturalistic ideal, not of a Messiah, but of a messianic age, towards which all humanity was gradually progressing. And the emancipation, this great political movement of Jews being granted civil rights in Europe in the 19th century, was itself seen as a crucial phase in the coming of this age of universal peace and harmony, since it gave the Jews a renewed opportunity, after centuries of contempt and segregation, to fulfill their God-given role as a light to the nations, a phrase that is taken from the book of Isaiah, by serving as exemplars of pure monotheism and the ethical teachings of the Torah and prophets. Many of the features associated with the coming of the Messiah, such as the restoration of ancient monarchy, the reinstitution of a hereditary priesthood and animal sacrifices, and the assumption that Jews would somehow come to dominate the rest of the world, were repugnant to the progressive, liberal, and democratic spirit of the Enlightenment and Jewish movements that embraced the Enlightenment. And in one of our liberal Jewish documents we write, Rabbinic Judaism accepted the apocalyptic belief in a Messiah who will one day gather in the exiles and sit on the throne of a restored Davidic monarchy. We affirm the universalistic hope of the prophets for a messianic age brought about gradually through the acceptance of God's will by all humanity. One particular aspect that progressive Judaism rejects was the hope for the rebuilding of the temple, which plays an important part in traditional Jewish liturgy but is omitted or changed in our progressive prayer books. Meanwhile, traditional Jews still await the coming of the Messiah, as they have done for so many centuries. As Hasidim of the Bratslava sect were being led into the gas chambers, they sang to a haunting tune the words of Maimonides' 12th principle of faith, the 12th of 13 principles of faith, which is one of the few widely accepted dogmatic statements in Jewish history. Namely, I believe with perfect faith in the coming of the Messiah, and though he tarry, I will wait every day for him to come. And this is still sung as a song very widely in the Jewish world, very moving, plangent melody. Some have suggested that it is precisely the always longed for but ever deferred nature of the messianic hope that has preserved the Jewish people and given them the inner strength to persevere through so many ages of suffering and persecution. So the whole point of the Messiah, in fact, is that he never comes. Yeah? If the dreams that are fulfilled often crumble away, and the fulfillment never quite measures up. So perhaps it has to remain precisely an unfulfilled dream. Both communism and Zionism could be seen, and perhaps other modern movements as well, could be seen as secularized versions of the messianic hope, asserting that human efforts, not divine intervention, will bring about the perfect age of redemption. That is why some ultra-Orthodox Jews reject Israel, the state of Israel, as illegitimate before the coming of the Messiah, a sort of blasphemous attempt to preempt God, as it were. While many of the modern Orthodox, in contrast, see Israel as the first flowering of our redemption, a phrase that's used in many prayers in Orthodox synagogues. The more extreme Orthodox Zionists, the settler movement and their supporters, believe that only when Jews reclaim the whole land of Israel will God be stirred to send the Messiah. And this is part of the ideological foundation of that sort of colonizing the West Bank and so forth. Progressive Jews, on the other hand, I'm sorry to end with progressive Jews, but that's the notes that I was basing it on, believe that Jews must join with and help to lead other human beings in following God's ethical demands to make the world more just and peaceful. Thus, humans in cooperation with God will gradually progress towards the Messianic age, when the full God-given potential of every person can be realized, and when, in the words of Isaiah, they shall not hurt or destroy in all my holy mountain, but the earth shall be full of the knowledge of the Eternal One, as the waters cover the sea. A very resonant and beautiful passage. And then, in the words of Zechariah, with which we conclude every service, the eternal God, Eternal One, shall be sovereign over the whole earth. On that day, the eternal God shall be one, and God's name shall be one. In other words, God will be acknowledged as one by all humanity. Thank you.